British income tax. In 1799, British Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger faced a crisis. Britain was at war with Napoleon's France, and the government desperately needed revenue. Pitt proposed something radical: a direct tax on income. This was controversial. The British considered income taxation an invasion of privacy and an oppressive government intrusion, but Pitt promised it was temporary. The income tax would last only as long as the war with France. Once Napoleon was defeated, the tax would be abolished. Parliament agreed and passed the income tax as an emergency wartime measure. The tax was structured to fall primarily on the wealthy. Only those earning more than £60 annually paid it, roughly equivalent to $100,000 today. The poorest workers were completely exempt. The rate started at 2 pence per pound, less than 1%, and applied only to income above the threshold. Pitt presented this as a small patriotic sacrifice by those who could afford it. The tax was indeed repealed in 1816, after Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo. The British celebrated. The hated income tax was gone. The government even ordered all records of who had paid the tax to be destroyed, supposedly to protect taxpayers' privacy, but likely to prevent anyone from tracking what had been collected. Parliament wanted to erase all evidence that income tax had ever existed. But the government had tasted income tax revenue and liked it. Running a modern state without income tax proved difficult. Tariffs and excise taxes couldn't generate the revenue that direct taxation could. In 1842, Prime Minister Robert Peel reintroduced income tax as a temporary measure to address budget deficits. It was supposed to last 3 years. Parliament extended it after 3 years. They said just a few more years were needed. Then they extended it again and again. Each time, the extension was presented as temporary, just a bit longer to address current fiscal challenges. By the 1860s, politicians stopped pretending it was temporary. The income tax had become permanent, providing too much revenue for any government to voluntarily abandon. The temporary wartime emergency tax, introduced in 1799 for the Napoleonic Wars, is still collected in the United Kingdom today, 225 years later. The British income tax started at 2 pence per pound, less than 1%. Today's top rate exceeds 45%. What began as an emergency levy on the wealthy to fund a specific war became the government's primary revenue source, applied to almost all workers. The exemption threshold has been adjusted over the decades, bringing more and more people into the tax net. Workers who would never have paid in 1799 now see significant portions of their income taxed. The pattern was set. Introduce a tax as temporary during crisis, let people accept it under duress, then quietly make it permanent once they're accustomed to paying it. The income tax wasn't the first time governments did this, but it was one of the most successful. Politicians discovered that once people adjust to a new tax, removing it becomes politically difficult. The revenue is too useful, and eliminating it requires painful spending cuts that no politician wants to make. Today, when British politicians propose new taxes, they rarely claim they're temporary anymore. The lesson of the income tax taught governments that temporary taxes become permanent, and taxpayers learned that temporary means nothing. The word has been so thoroughly discredited that using it actually makes voters more suspicious rather than less. American income tax. The United States learned from Britain's example. The U.S. Constitution originally prohibited direct federal taxes on individuals. The federal government was funded primarily by tariffs and excise taxes. The Founding Fathers deliberately designed the system this way, fearing that direct taxation would give the federal government too much power over citizens. But in 1861, the Civil War began, and President Abraham Lincoln needed money desperately. The Union Army required funding on a scale that tariffs alone couldn't provide. Congress passed the Revenue Act of 1861, introducing the first federal income tax in American history. It was explicitly temporary, a wartime emergency measure to fund the Union Army. The tax would be repealed once the war ended and the crisis passed. The initial rate was 3% on income over $800 annually, equivalent to about $25,000 today. Like Britain's first income tax, it targeted the wealthy while exempting average workers. Lincoln and Congress promised this was purely a wartime necessity that would disappear with the return of peace, and surprisingly, it was. The income tax was repealed in 1872, 7 years after the war ended. Americans celebrated being free from income taxation once again. The experiment with direct taxation was over. The Constitution's prohibition on direct taxes had been temporarily suspended for emergency purposes and was now back in force. But like Britain before them, the U.S. government missed the revenue. Running an expanding nation without income tax proved challenging. In 1894, Congress passed a new income tax, supposedly to replace revenue lost from reducing tariffs. The rate was 2% on income over $4,000, about $140,000 today, again targeting only the wealthy. The Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutional in 1895, striking down the tax as a direct tax not apportioned among states as the Constitution required. This should have ended income taxation in America. The highest court in the land had declared it illegal. Instead, it led to a constitutional amendment. In 1909, Congress proposed the 16th Amendment, explicitly granting the federal government power to tax income without apportionment. Supporters promised the income tax would only affect the very wealthy, the top 1% of earners. The average worker would never pay it. Working-class Americans were told this was about making millionaires pay their fair share, not about taxing ordinary wages. The amendment was ratified in 1913, and Congress immediately passed a new income tax with a top rate of 7% on income over $500,000, equivalent to about $15 million today. It was sold as a tax on the rich, a way to make the wealthy pay their fair share. Only about 2% of Americans paid any income tax at all. Then World War I began. The temporary wartime emergency allowed Congress to dramatically increase rates. By 1918, the top rate reached 77%. After the war, rates dropped but never to pre-war levels. The crisis created the precedent for high rates that persisted during peace. The wealthy who had been taxed at 7% before the war now faced rates above 50% even during peacetime. World War II brought another emergency. Top rates reached 94% in 1944-45. These were clearly temporary wartime rates. No one expected 94% taxation to continue during peacetime. The government explicitly described them as wartime sacrifice that would end with victory. But when the war ended, top rates remained above 90% until 1964, then above 70% until 1981. Nearly 4 decades after World War II ended, Americans were still paying temporary wartime tax rates. The emergency that justified 94% taxation had been over for a generation, but the rates barely budged. Meanwhile, the tax expanded to cover more people. The threshold for paying income tax dropped steadily. Exemptions decreased. By the 1950s, most American workers paid income tax, not just the wealthy. The promise that average workers would never pay income tax had been completely broken. Today's income tax bears no resemblance to the limited tax on the wealthy promised in 1913. Nearly all workers pay it. The average American spends months each year working just to pay income tax. Tax filing has become so complex that most people need professional help or software to comply. The temporary Civil War emergency tax, repealed in 1872, was resurrected in 1913 and has expanded far beyond anything its supporters claimed it would be. The lesson? Temporary wartime taxes become permanent. Limited taxes on the rich become universal taxes on everyone. Emergency rates become standard rates. And the income tax, introduced 161 years ago as a temporary crisis measure, is now so entrenched that eliminating it seems impossible. Politicians across the political spectrum debate tax rates, but almost none seriously propose eliminating the income tax entirely. It's become part of the permanent structure of government. Yet, telephone tax. In 1898, the United States went to war with Spain over Cuba. The Spanish-American War was brief, lasting only 10 weeks, but expensive. Congress needed to raise revenue quickly to fund the military campaign. The war was expected to be short, so temporary taxes made sense. Among various emergency taxes passed was a 3% excise tax on telephone service. This seemed logical. In 1898, only wealthy Americans had telephones. The technology was new and expensive. Taxing telephone calls was effectively a luxury tax on the rich to fund the war effort. The tax was explicitly temporary, tied to the Spanish-American War emergency. The war ended in August 1898. American victory was swift and decisive. The emergency was over. The temporary tax should have ended. Congress had clearly stated the tax was only for the war. It didn't. Congress kept renewing the temporary Spanish-American War telephone tax year after year. The emergency that justified it was long over, but the revenue was useful. Why eliminate a tax that people were already paying? The amounts were small, a few cents per call, so there wasn't much public outcry. Over the decades, telephone service expanded from a luxury for the rich to a necessity for average Americans. By the mid-20th century, almost every household had a telephone. The tax that originally hit only wealthy people now affected nearly everyone. What had been a luxury tax on the rich became a universal tax on a basic utility. The tax rate changed over the years, sometimes increasing during World War I and II, sometimes decreasing during peacetime, but it never disappeared. The temporary war tax became a permanent feature of phone bills. By the 1960s, few Americans even knew why there was a tax on telephone service. It was just one of those things, like death and taxes themselves. By the 1990s, the telephone excise tax was generating billions in annual revenue, far more than the entire Spanish-American War had cost. The war had cost about $250 million total. The tax was collecting that much every few years. The war lasted 10 weeks in 1898. The tax lasted over a century. The legal basis for the tax became increasingly questionable as telephone billing evolved. The original tax applied to long-distance calls billed by distance and time, the standard method in 1898. But by the 1990s, most Americans had unlimited long-distance plans or per-minute rates that didn't vary by distance. The tax's legal foundation no longer matched how the service worked. In 2006, the IRS finally admitted defeat. After multiple court cases ruled that the tax didn't legally apply to modern phone service, it was written for distance-based billing, which no longer existed. The IRS announced it would stop collecting the tax on long-distance service. The agency even refunded some payments from the previous 3 years, a rare admission that the government had been collecting a tax it had no legal right to collect. But the tax didn't entirely disappear. It still applies to local-only phone service under certain conditions, and it took 108 years, from 1898 to 2006, for even partial repeal of a tax introduced for a 10-week war. The IRS didn't voluntarily stop collecting it, they were forced to by court rulings. The telephone excise tax is the perfect example of temporary taxation becoming permanent. A luxury tax on the rich became a universal tax on everyone. A wartime emergency measure outlasted the war by over a century. And only court rulings forced partial repeal. Congress never voluntarily eliminated it, despite the emergency ending 108 years earlier. Even today, remnants of the tax remain, still collecting money for a war that ended before anyone's great-great-grandparents were born. Entertainment tax. In 1916, Britain was deep into World War I. The government needed revenue for the war effort and introduced an entertainment tax on tickets to theaters, cinemas, concerts, and sporting events. This was sold as a wartime sacrifice. Entertainment was a luxury, and taxing it during the war made sense. People should be supporting soldiers, not watching shows. The tax was explicitly temporary, tied to the war emergency. When the Great War ended in 1918, the entertainment tax should have ended too. The war was over, the emergency passed, and the tax's justification disappeared. It didn't. The tax continued through the 1920s and 1930s. When World War II began in 1939, the entertainment tax was still in place from the previous war. The Second War provided justification to increase it further rather than end it. Rates went up, but the tax that should have ended in 1918 just kept going. After World War II ended in 1945, the entertainment tax remained. The government argued it was needed for post-war reconstruction. Britain had enormous debts from the war and needed every revenue source available. Then it was needed for building the welfare state. The National Health Service and expanded social programs required funding. Then it was just part of the tax system, and no one questioned it anymore. The entertainment tax wasn't fully abolished until 1960, 44 years after its introduction as a temporary World War I emergency measure. For over 4 decades, British people paid a tax on theater tickets and cinema admissions to fund a war that had ended before most of them were born. A person born in 1920 would have paid entertainment tax their entire adult life for a war that ended when they were 2 years old. But even that wasn't the end. When the entertainment tax was abolished in 1960, it was partially replaced by other taxes on admissions and events. The revenue stream didn't disappear. It was reorganized under different names and categories. The government couldn't bring itself to actually lose the revenue, so eliminating one entertainment tax meant creating different taxes that served similar purposes. Today, the UK has value-added tax, VAT, that applies to many entertainment services. While this isn't technically the same as the 1916 entertainment tax, it serves the same function, taxing entertainment purchases. The specific temporary wartime tax ended, but the principle of taxing entertainment that it established became permanent. The entertainment tax showed how taxes outlive their justifications. The war that required the tax ended, but the tax continued. New justifications were found: reconstruction, welfare, general revenue. Once a revenue stream exists, governments find reasons to maintain it. Politicians are creative at finding new purposes for old taxes. And taxpayers forget. By the 1950s, few British people remembered that the entertainment tax was supposed to be temporary. It had always been there in their lifetimes. The idea that theater tickets shouldn't be taxed seemed radical, not conservative. Young people couldn't imagine a world without entertainment taxes because they'd never experienced one. This is the real danger of temporary taxes. They persist long enough to seem normal, and eventually no one remembers they were supposed to end. Each new generation grows up with the tax as part of life, and the original promise of temporary status is forgotten completely. Sales tax increases. Sales taxes and VAT are often adjusted with temporary increases that become permanent fixtures. The pattern repeats across countries and decades, but the mechanism is always the same. Crisis hits, sales tax increases temporarily. Crisis ends, tax stays. In the United States, many states introduced or increased sales taxes during the Great Depression as temporary revenue measures. State governments faced collapsing revenues as property values dropped and income taxes declined. Kansas increased its sales tax in 1933 as an emergency measure. The rate was supposed to drop when the economic crisis ended. It never did. Instead, Kansas sales tax increased further over the decades, reaching rates multiple times the temporary depression emergency rate. In Canada, the Goods and Services Tax, GST, was introduced in 1991 at 7%. Politicians opposed to it campaigned on reducing or eliminating it, calling it an unfair tax on everything Canadians bought. When they took power, they reduced it to 6%, then 5%, but never eliminated it. The temporary need for this revenue source became permanent political reality. Eliminating it entirely would require finding billions in replacement revenue that no politician wanted to identify. Japan introduced a consumption tax in 1989 at 3% to address budget deficits. It was controversial, and the government implied it was a temporary measure to address fiscal crisis. The Japanese public hated it. The government that introduced it was voted out in the next election. But the tax remained. The rate increased to 5% in 1997, to 8% in 2014, and to 10% in 2019. The temporary crisis measure became permanent and kept increasing. Each increase sparked protests, but each increase stayed. European countries show the same pattern with VAT. When economic crises hit, VAT rates increase temporarily. After the 2008 financial crisis, multiple European countries raised VAT as emergency measures. Greece increased VAT to 23%, Spain increased to 21%, Portugal to 23%, Ireland went from 21% to 23%. These were sold as temporary austerity measures until economies recovered. The economies recovered. Stock markets hit new highs. Unemployment fell. GDP grew. But the VAT rates didn't decrease. The temporary crisis taxes became the new normal. In some countries, politicians occasionally propose reducing VAT back to pre-crisis levels, but it rarely happens. The higher revenue is too useful for funding government programs. The pattern is global and consistent. Sales taxes and VAT increase during crises and rarely decrease afterward. Each increase is presented as temporary, necessary, and limited. Each increase becomes permanent. Citizens are told, just for now, but experience forever. What makes sales taxes particularly insidious is that they're hidden in prices. Income tax appears on paychecks, making it visible and annoying. Workers see exactly how much is withheld. Sales tax is buried in purchase prices. Many consumers don't notice a 1 to 2% increase in sales tax because they're not calculating it separately. The price is just higher, and people assume it's inflation or market changes. This invisibility helps sales tax increases persist. If people don't notice the tax or think about it consciously, they don't demand its repeal when the crisis ends. The temporary increase just becomes the new rate, and life goes on. There are no protests, no political pressure, no demands for return to previous rates. Governments learn this lesson well. Sales taxes and VAT are now the preferred method for temporary tax increases because they're easy to implement, hard to notice, and almost impossible to reduce once established. Politicians know that once a sales tax rate goes up, it effectively never comes down. The temporary increase becomes the new baseline for future increases. Luxury tax. In 1990, the United States faced budget deficits and political pressure to reduce them. President George H.W. Bush had promised no new taxes, but was forced to compromise with Congress. The result was the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of 1990, which included a 10% luxury tax on boats over $100,000, cars over $30,000, aircraft over $250,000, and jewelry and furs over $10,000. This was sold as a tax on the wealthy who could afford luxuries while the country faced fiscal challenges. The tax would primarily affect rich people buying yachts and private planes, hardly a sympathetic group. It was presented as temporary, necessary to address the deficit, and fair, make the rich pay for their luxuries. The tax was a disaster. The luxury boat industry collapsed almost immediately. Wealthy Americans stopped buying boats, or bought them overseas to avoid the tax. Why pay 10% more when you can buy the same boat in the Bahamas? American boat manufacturers laid off thousands of workers. The aircraft industry saw similar impacts. Jewelry stores struggled. The fur industry contracted sharply. The jobs lost were mainly working-class manufacturing jobs, not wealthy executives. Boat builders, aircraft mechanics, and craftsmen lost employment because wealthy people decided not to purchase American-made luxury items subject to the tax. The tax intended to hit the rich ended up destroying middle-class jobs. By 1993, it was clear the tax was counterproductive. It raised far less revenue than projected. Only about $30 million annually instead of the projected $300 million, while destroying industries and eliminating an estimated 25,000 jobs. The economic damage far exceeded the minimal revenue collected. Congress repealed most of the luxury tax in 1993, just 3 years after implementation. The taxes on boats, aircraft, planes, jewelry, and furs were eliminated. But one luxury tax remained: the tax on expensive cars. The automobile luxury tax continued until 2002, lasting 12 years total. Even after clear evidence that luxury taxes destroyed more value than they created, even after repealing the other luxury taxes, Congress kept the car tax for nearly a decade after repealing the others. Why? Because it raised revenue, and Congress was reluctant to give up any revenue source. The car luxury tax generated money for the federal budget, and eliminating it required finding replacement revenue or accepting higher deficits. So, the temporary deficit reduction measure persisted for 12 years despite being economically destructive and despite Congress recognizing the failure by repealing the other luxury taxes. The luxury tax is unusual because it was actually repealed. Most temporary taxes aren't. But it still followed the pattern. What was introduced as temporary persisted far longer than originally intended. And the decision to finally repeal it came only after overwhelming evidence of economic harm, not because the deficit crisis had ended. The deficit was still large in 2002 when the car luxury tax finally ended. This case shows that even when temporary taxes are eventually repealed, it takes years of lobbying, evidence of harm, and political pressure. Taxes don't end automatically when the crisis that justified them ends. They persist until forced out. And even overwhelming evidence of failure, the luxury tax clearly destroyed jobs and raised minimal revenue, isn't enough to trigger immediate repeal. It took a decade to eliminate a demonstrably failed tax. Payroll tax. This case is a reversal, a temporary tax cut that ended right on schedule, returning to the higher temporary tax from decades earlier. In 2010, facing the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, Congress passed a temporary payroll tax cut, reducing the employee portion of Social Security tax from 6.2% to 4.2% for 2 years. This was explicitly temporary, a stimulus measure to boost the economy by giving workers more take-home pay. Everyone understood it would end in 2012, and it did. The payroll tax returned to 6.2% as scheduled. Unlike temporary tax increases that become permanent, this temporary tax decrease ended exactly when promised. But here's the interesting part. The 6.2% rate itself has an interesting history. Social Security taxes started at 1% in 1937 when the program began. Workers paid 1%, employers paid 1%, for a combined 2% tax on wages. This was sold as a small contribution to a retirement fund. Workers and employers would each pay 1%, building up savings for eventual retirement. The rate was supposed to increase gradually to 3% by 1949, then stop permanently at that level. It didn't stop. The rate increased to 1.5% in 1950, 2% in 1954, 2.25% in 1955, and kept climbing. Each increase was justified by Social Security's financial needs. The program was paying out more than anticipated. Demographics were shifting. More revenue was needed to keep the system solvent. By 1990, the rate reached 6.2%, where it has remained since. But this wasn't presented as the final rate. It's just where the rate has stayed for over 3 decades. Future increases aren't ruled out. They're periodically proposed when Social Security faces funding shortfalls. Commissions regularly warn that rates must rise or benefits must fall. So, the temporary 2010-2012 payroll tax cut was actually a temporary reduction in a tax rate that has continuously increased from its original level. The rate that returned in 2012, 6.2%, is over 6 times higher than the rate when Social Security taxes began, 1%. The original Social Security tax was sold as a small contribution to a retirement fund. Workers and employers would each pay 1%, building up savings for eventual retirement. The idea that this rate would eventually exceed 6%, 12.4% combined employer-employee, would have seemed absurd in 1937. Politicians promised the rate would never exceed 3% combined, but each increase was presented as necessary and temporary, just until Social Security got back on firm financial footing. Then another increase would be needed, and another. The pattern continued for decades. Each time, voters were told this increase would stabilize the system. Each time, another increase followed years later. The payroll tax shows how temporary works in both directions. Temporary increases become permanent. Temporary decreases end right on schedule. The ratchet only works one way. Rates go up during crises and stay up during recoveries. When taxes are cut temporarily, everyone knows it's actually temporary. When taxes are raised temporarily, they become permanent. Disaster relief surcharges. Natural disasters create opportunities for temporary taxes that become permanent. The pattern is simple. Disaster strikes, government imposes a temporary surcharge on sales tax or property tax to fund recovery. Recovery completes. Surcharge remains. After the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, California imposed various temporary assessments and fees for rebuilding. The city was destroyed. Over 80% of San Francisco burned. Massive reconstruction was needed. Many of these taxes were supposed to end once reconstruction was complete. Some lasted decades, folded into general revenue once people forgot their original purpose. The earthquake was forgotten, but the taxes remained. After Hurricane Katrina in 2005, Louisiana parishes imposed temporary sales tax, increases to fund recovery. New Orleans added a temporary 4% hotel tax surcharge specifically for rebuilding. The devastation was enormous. Whole neighborhoods destroyed, businesses wiped out, infrastructure ruined. The city needed revenue for reconstruction. The city recovered, tourism returned, buildings were repaired, infrastructure rebuilt. The French Quarter came back. Hotels filled with visitors again. The economy grew. Many of the temporary Katrina taxes remained in place for over a decade, well past the point of recovery. The disaster that justified them was over, but the taxes continued. Japan imposed a temporary income tax surcharge after the 2011 earthquake and tsunami to fund reconstruction. The disaster killed nearly 20,000 people and caused over $200 billion in damage. The Fukushima nuclear plant melted down. Massive reconstruction was clearly necessary. The surcharge was supposed to last until 2037, a 26-year temporary tax. This exceeds the typical human attention span by so much that few Japanese taxpayers will remember why they're paying it by the time it supposedly ends. Children born after the earthquake will be adults paying a tax for a disaster they never experienced, and there's no guarantee it will actually end in 2037. By that point, the tax will have existed for so long that repealing it will seem like a radical change rather than returning to normal. A new generation of politicians might find reasons to extend the temporary earthquake tax even further. Perhaps another disaster will justify continuation. Perhaps the revenue will be too useful to give up. The disaster relief pattern is particularly insidious because it exploits tragedy. Who wants to oppose taxes for earthquake victims or hurricane recovery? Voting against disaster relief taxes seems heartless. Politicians who question these taxes are accused of not caring about victims. So, temporary surcharges pass with overwhelming support and little scrutiny. But once the disaster is forgotten and recovery is complete, the tax continues. Removing it requires political will to eliminate a revenue source, which is much harder than opposing a new tax. The path of least resistance is to leave the tax in place, rename it for general purposes, and keep collecting. Why go through the political effort of cutting taxes when you can just quietly keep collecting? Some jurisdictions are honest about this. They impose disaster recovery fees, knowing they'll become permanent revenue. Others genuinely intend temporary taxes, but lack the discipline to repeal them later. The result is the same: temporary disaster taxes that outlive the disasters by decades. Firearms Excise Tax. In 1919, the United States emerged from World War I facing significant war debts. The war had cost over $30 billion, an enormous sum. Congress passed the Revenue Act of 1919, which included a 10% excise tax on firearms and ammunition. This was explicitly a temporary revenue measure to help pay off war debts from the Great War. The war was over. The emergency was passed. The tax was supposed to be temporary, just until the war debts were managed. Then it would disappear like other wartime revenue measures. Victory was achieved, peace returned, and temporary wartime taxes should end. It didn't disappear. The tax persisted through the 1920s even as other wartime taxes were repealed. In 1937, Congress passed the Pittman-Robertson Act, which redirected the firearms excise tax revenue specifically to wildlife conservation. The tax rate eventually increased to 11% on firearms and 10% on ammunition. This created political cover for the tax's continuation. Now, it wasn't just general revenue. It funded conservation efforts. Hunters and sportsmen actually supported the tax because it funded habitat preservation, wildlife management, and public shooting ranges. Groups like Ducks Unlimited and the National Wildlife Federation backed the tax because it provided dedicated funding for programs they supported. The tax has remained ever since, generating over $1 billion annually. It's no longer justified as a temporary World War I debt payment. That would be absurd 105 years later. Instead, it's now a permanent conservation funding mechanism. The purpose changed, but the tax remained. This illustrates another pattern. When temporary taxes outlive their original justification, governments find new purposes for them. The revenue stream exists, people are accustomed to paying it, so rather than eliminate the tax, just redirect it to something else. Find a sympathetic cause, like wildlife conservation, and suddenly the tax has new political support. The Firearms Excise Tax was a wartime revenue measure in 1919. It became a conservation funding mechanism in 1937. It remains today as a permanent excise tax that gun buyers pay, generating over $1 billion annually for wildlife conservation. The Pittman-Robertson Act is considered one of the most successful conservation funding mechanisms in American history. Few gun buyers today know they're paying a tax originally imposed to fund World War I debt payments. The tax is over a century old, far removed from its original emergency justification. But it continues, now with a different stated purpose that has nothing to do with the war that created it. The war emergency is forgotten, but the tax rate remains. Import tariffs. Tariffs and import duties are frequently imposed as temporary measures to protect domestic industries during crises, then become permanent protectionist policies long after the crisis ends. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930 in the United States imposed high tariffs on thousands of imported goods, supposedly as a temporary measure to protect American businesses during the Great Depression. Congress believed that protecting American companies from foreign competition would preserve jobs during the economic crisis. Economists warned it would worsen the Depression by provoking retaliatory tariffs from other countries. They were right. International trade collapsed, deepening the global economic crisis. Other nations imposed their own tariffs in response, creating a downward spiral of protectionism that strangled global commerce. The tariffs weren't fully repealed until trade agreements decades later gradually reduced them. But even today, many tariff categories created in the 1930s still exist, though at lower rates. The temporary Depression-era trade barriers persisted for generations, shaping American trade policy for nearly a century. Britain's Corn Laws, imposed in 1815 after the Napoleonic Wars, were tariffs on imported grain, supposedly to protect British farmers during the post-war economic adjustment period. After years of war, British agriculture needed time to adjust to peacetime conditions. The tariffs were supposed to be temporary measures until agriculture stabilized. The Corn Laws lasted until 1846, 31 years. They were finally repealed only after massive political pressure, and the Irish potato famine made it morally indefensible to keep food prices high through import tariffs. The temporary post-war agricultural protection lasted 3 decades despite causing widespread poverty and hunger among the working class who couldn't afford bread. In modern times, countries impose temporary tariffs in response to economic disputes or crises, claiming they will be lifted once the situation resolves. These tariffs often remain for years, becoming entrenched in trade policy long after the original dispute is forgotten. Steel and aluminum tariffs imposed by various countries as temporary measures to protect domestic industries often persist indefinitely. Each extension is justified by some new crisis or concern, but the underlying pattern is the same. Temporary becomes permanent. The original steel crisis passes, but the tariffs remain. Import duties are particularly prone to permanence because industries that benefit from protection become powerful lobbying forces. Once tariffs protect domestic steel producers from foreign competition, those producers fight politically to maintain protection. They hire workers who don't want to lose jobs, creating voting blocs that support continuing temporary tariffs. The original justification, emergency protection during crisis, becomes irrelevant. The new justification is protecting existing jobs and industries. And since there's always some economic uncertainty somewhere, there's always a reason to maintain temporary protection for one more year. Politicians can always point to some threat: foreign competition, unfair trade practices, national security, to justify extending temporary tariffs indefinitely. 10 taxes introduced as temporary measures. 10 taxes that lasted decades or centuries beyond their stated purpose. The income tax in Britain, 225 years after the temporary Napoleonic War tax. The income tax in America, 161 years after the temporary Civil War tax. The telephone excise tax, 108 years for a 10-week war. The entertainment tax, 44 years after World War I ended. Sales tax increases across the world that never decrease. The luxury tax that took 12 years to partially repeal despite obvious failure. Payroll taxes that started at 1% and reached 6.2%. Disaster relief surcharges that outlived the disasters. The Firearms Excise Tax, 105 years after World War I. Import duties that persist generations after the crises that created them. The pattern is universal and predictable. Governments introduce taxes during emergencies. They promise the taxes are temporary, the emergency ends. The tax remains. Sometimes the tax is renamed or repurposed. The World War I firearms tax becomes conservation funding. The entertainment tax becomes VAT. The disaster recovery fee becomes general revenue. But the money keeps flowing, regardless of what it's called. This happens because eliminating a tax requires deliberate action, while maintaining it requires nothing. Inertia favors taxation. Once a revenue stream exists, it takes political will to stop it. Politicians rarely volunteer to reduce revenue. They're always finding new things to fund, new programs to create, new constituents to satisfy. Taxpayers forget. A tax that's been collected for 50 years doesn't feel temporary anymore. It's just part of life. Young people never knew a time without the tax, so they don't think to question it. The promise that it would end was made to people who are now dead. The temporary label is a political tool to make taxes more acceptable. It's easier to pass a temporary tax than a permanent one. Voters tolerate short-term burdens more easily than permanent changes. Once passed, the temporary tax quietly becomes permanent without another vote, without debate, without the political cost of explicitly making it permanent. Some taxes eventually end, but only after decades and only with massive political pressure. The luxury tax was repealed after destroying industries and costing jobs. Even then, part of it remained for 12 years. The entertainment tax took 44 years. These are the exceptions, not the pattern. Most temporary taxes never end. They transform, get renamed, find new justifications, but the collection continues. The World War I telephone tax collected revenue for a century. The Napoleonic Wars income tax collects revenue 2 centuries later. These taxes have outlived the crises by generations. The lesson is clear. When government says a tax is temporary, assume it's permanent. When they promise it will end after the emergency, assume the emergency will be redefined or replaced by a new crisis justifying continuation. When they guarantee it won't increase, assume increases are coming. Temporary is a lie governments tell to make taxation more politically palatable. Once the tax exists, once the revenue flows, once people adjust to paying it, the incentive to eliminate it disappears. The path of least resistance is permanent taxation. You're paying taxes right now that were supposed to end before your grandparents were born. Taxes for wars that ended a century ago. Taxes for emergencies no one remembers. Taxes whose original purpose has been forgotten, replaced by new justifications that have nothing to do with why the tax was created. And when the next crisis comes, and there will be a next crisis, governments will introduce new, temporary taxes. They'll promise these are different. These really will end when the emergency passes. These won't become permanent like all the others. They're lying. The next temporary tax will join the others, collecting revenue long after everyone's forgotten what emergency justified it. Because that's what temporary taxes do. They last forever.